Hi, everybody, and welcome to the next installment of the Mirrors webinars. This one is about how data analytics are enhancing aged care. It's definitely a topic that we're very passionate about. We spend a lot of our time looking at data and sharing data with all levels of organizations in the industry, including the department. And we love looking at the data and trying to figure out what it means and what it's telling us and where it's going. So we thought this would be a great opportunity to have a discussion about it with you. And we've got hundreds of providers and members of the industry joining us today. So really excited about that. I just wanted to remind everybody, for certainly this qualifies as CPD points for those of you who have to collect continuing professional development points. This does classify, so please make sure you capture that. And also, just to remind you, there's so many of you on the webinar today. There's no opportunity to interact live. There's too many people and it's a tight format, but we don't have a client panel today. We're going to share a lot of information and be discussing some of these issues amongst ourselves. But what we'd like to do, if we have the time, is to address some of the questions in the chat. So please ask questions. Remember to tag everyone in those questions, not just the panel, so everyone can see the questions. We don't get repetitions. We've got Taryn on the panel today, who's going to be monitoring that FAQ with the questions and the chat, and we're going to highlight some of those questions at the end, time permitting. So welcome also to Tyler and to Rob, who joined me on the panel today to talk about data and analytics. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather today. I pay my respects to the elders past and present. Of course, I extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people on the call today. So what are we going to talk about? We've got a packed lot of information. As always, on the way into the registration of these webinars, we take the opportunity to poll the participants. So we've got a couple of hundred different organisations represented in that poll today. So a good sample of the industry. I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. Then we're going to get a presentation from Rob about Moneyball. Many of you will know the Moneyball movie with Brad Pitt, and we'd like to draw an analogy between the data and analytics of that example and what we're seeing in ACFI and AN-ACC today. And data and insights, a bit of an update from Tyler on what he's seeing around some of the data and insights for the industry. And then I'm going to share some client stories about how we're seeing that play out in real live examples of providers today that we're working with. So for those of you who joined the webinar and interested in the topic about data and analytics broadly in the industry, just wanted to clarify that if you think about the data and analytics across the industry, maybe in three buckets, the way we're thinking about it, there's the industry data and the statistics that sort of drive our industry, analysing that. And then there's where we spend a lot of our time looking at the funding and care minutes data and the statistics that are being now collected around that through the external assessment process, and really organisations really looking at their own data and where they are. That what used to be the average daily subsidy, ADS, used to rule our world and how we were tracking with funding. Now it's a little bit more complex and a little bit broader. We'll talk a little bit about that through the presentations. And then the last one really that I think is a big bucket of data, big data, is clinical data. There's one side of it which is about what you can model and what you can predict through clinical insights. But also what's becoming really apparent, we'll talk a bit about today, is how you build a picture of risk, how the Quality Commission and the department are starting to build a picture of risk around a lot of that clinical data and a lot of the other data that's being submitted now through the various reporting mechanisms by providers to those agencies, and how they can view an organisation, a provider, and how they can build an algorithm and a picture of risk, so they can know where they put their resources and who to target in terms of the investigations that they do and the support that they provide to the industry to make sure that they're helping those most in need. So That's what data analytics looks like for us as a broad context. And as we go through, we'll be talking about specific areas amongst that. But really interested in your questions. Please provide those comments and have an active chat. We always get an active chat, and let's have a good webinar to close out the year. So the first question we've asked on the way in is this question: what is the AN-ACC strategy you have adopted? And this is a really interesting topic for us because I think a year in, just over a year in, and now with mandatory care minutes, we see quite a wide variety of strategies still being employed. People haven't quite landed on exactly what they're going to do, and you can see from these statistics and these responses, nearly half the industry, 42% of the industry, they're still looking at maximizing funding and filling the rosters to meet those care minutes. So that's for what we call a very ACFI strategy, ACFI-minded strategy still, which is maximizing funding. But the interconnection between funding and care minutes means that that's quite a difficult strategy to manage, and in some cases can get providers into trouble with trying to meet their rosters through agency, and that significantly increases the average cost of a care minute, and also puts a greater demand on the available resources. So, but still a very prevalent industry. Strategy. Balancing your classifications with your rostered care minutes, having a more balanced view, or trying to balance those two things, which is sort of the way the model is intended. Between those two strategies, that makes up 80% of the industry. Still letting admissions, funding, and rostering teams continue to work independently. We still, that's probably a smaller number than we expect from the providers that we work with. Still, a large number of providers are still managing those three strategies quite independently of each other. A couple of organisations, a few organisations have started to bring those functions closer together, and even under the same executives. But still, a lot of them are running independently and don't have an AN-ACC strategy in place yet. I think it's really brave for those people ticking that box. I think the jury's still out for a lot of people, and they're moving towards a clear plan for how they're going to manage their AN-ACC within the organisation, but they may not have landed on it yet. So interested where you land in that across those choices if you haven't responded. What is your resourcing approach to the AN-ACC process? This is also very interesting. We see a wide variety of strategies. We see organisations that have transferred all of their ACFI resources over to AN-ACC resources, and in some larger organisations, that's a significant number of people. And then we see people in the other direction who have moved those roles towards more quality roles. Some of those roles that were being filled by clinicians, those clinicians have been re-engaged into direct care minute activities. And so there's still quite a wide variety. There's still a decentralized model with people looking at AN-ACC very much on the floor, looking at residents, looking at clinical information, very decentralized, providing that information into some sort of a centralized system or process. There's also people who have balanced decentralized roles with centralized roles. But you can see there that majority of people have kept most of their ACFI roles and converted them into AN-ACC, so kept most of those staff in those roles. And then the second biggest category, reducing the amount of resource, deployed them to other quality care roles, as I said. I'm expecting that to grow significantly. Centralization, some people have taken advantage of that. AN-ACC definitely lends itself to some centralization and even to outsourcing, which is the fourth category, because it's being driven by an independent assessor, and that independent assessor doesn't know your resident as well as you do, so they rely quite heavily on what they can see, what they can gather by talking to staff, but also what they can see from the documentation that's provided. So you can do a similar thing in the process when you're trying to manage AN-ACC through centralized resources and accessing a lot of information remotely. So a lot of organizations are taking advantage of both centralizing the information and process, and also even outsourcing some of that process. And we have a number of clients looking at that and to gain efficiencies. And we'll talk about a bit more about that later on. And what is your confidence level with the approach to managing AN-ACC and care minute data? So now that we're a year down for AN-ACC, but only a month in from mandatory care minutes, a little bit longer since the targets data has been gathered since June. But now that we're only a month in from mandatory care minutes, and one of the things that we definitely observed in the industry is with all the changes with the wage case and everything that was changing in the industry throughout this calendar year. A significant amount of the industry took a wait and see approach for most of the year, and really have moved more slowly towards how to manage care minute and care minute compliance than we would have expected. And that proved out in the quarterly financial reporting data that was submitted to the department. There was a real flattening of sort of growth in care minutes through the middle of this year. And really showed that most of the industry was waiting to see what happened and moving slowly towards that compliance and that targets. And obviously now with mandatory compliance and moving towards mandatory compliance now later in the year, there's been a significant shift, and we expect that to show in the QFR data when that becomes available. But obviously, you can see in these statistics that still the majority of the industry, we are confident in our approach that is working, is just over a third of the industry, but 2/3 of the industry are not sure, are not confident, or are somewhat confident because they're using some sort of BI technology to provide them some oversight of the process. But this, more than 2/3 of the industry is still thinking about whether they've got the right approach to this. So there's some interesting polling questions that we like to do on the way in to give us some sense of what people are thinking out there. Like I said, there's 203 responses in that data, but that 203 responses, rather than being individuals, is actually significantly from a large number, almost that number of providers. So it's an interesting snapshot about what's happening out there in the industry. Any thoughts on that, Rob and Tyler?
No, I think it's very key that when the industry's worked out, AN-ACC is very different than the conventional funding models we've had in the past, ACFI, RCS, and it's been constructed with a lot of research from the Wollongong University and a RUC study that we've been following and aligned with. And as the industry gets to become more familiar with the constructs of it, as well as open up to the concepts that it is an objective instrument now. We don't need the level of detail of a consumer and intimate knowledge that we did with an ACFI outcome, because the assessment model is also outsourced to department contractors in the form of the AMOs. So really what it is driving now is a lot of groups that are probably revisiting how direct care time can be prioritized. AN-ACC doesn't include the direct care now. So there's RNs, those clinical teams that would be assigned to AN-ACC activities, are resources that we can't run. So that's driving probably a lot more questions that providers are having amongst their organizational structures, and sort of bringing it back to, well, what do we need from this business function? What do we need to resource for that? Can that resourcing be less than what it was under ACFI? Because those were the intentions of AN-ACC. But I think as the industry gets to become more familiar with it and understand the processes of the reclassification, there will still be a lot of change at an organizational design level even, and that's really where I see the next wave or trend starting to occur in the sector.
Yeah, I think that change in adapting different processes is gradual, and that what really jumped out at me was the proportion of respondents who said that their strategy for AN-ACC was to maximize revenue, which I think we showed 42%, which to me, it just seemed like a really large proportion of people saying that they wanted to maximize revenue in light of the link to care minutes. But I have to wonder, maybe this time last year, that would have been 100% of respondents saying that they were maximized. So we're down to 42. And then, what will that look like this time a year from now? Potentially 0% of respondents would say that they would need to maximize revenue. So that sort of, gradual adapting, I think it is sort of highlighted in that.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Tyler, because certainly most of the people we speak to, haven't figured out whether the entire funding model is covering costs and the significance of the cross funding of care minutes and care funding across other cost centers like accommodation. That still hasn't worked itself out yet. So I guess probably embedded in that maximizing revenue is the principle of needing to maximize revenue to meet funding requirements and meet cost. To cover costs. So but obviously the point that you're making is that the connection between funding and care minutes means that maximizing funding obviously maximizes cost, and that's always go together. Great. Over to you, Rob, to take us through this Moneyball example.
No, I think so, Andrew. I was reflecting on this for the ACPA conference because I presented on the final day after Janet Anderson, and one of the things that was very core to the industry conference title was change, and we are going through a lot of change. There's a lot of reform playing out, but the change of AN-ACC and that mechanism has really required providers to think very unconventionally about funding, because now it does have a direct link for the first time ever to a care minute requirement and obligation that we must now evidence and be mindful of. And now that we're in our first mandated reporting period, these will be things that providers will need to really start to account for in a timely manner. And I guess reflecting on that, it brought me back to this period of my career when I first started out of university with an IBM company called SPSS, and we had a Major League Baseball team approach us called the Oakland Athletics, and the premise of that was really documented in a movie, but it was a book by Michael Lewis about effectively how this one gentleman and a statistician took effectively an unconventional approach to a century plus old sports. And really did it in a way that he needed to achieve effectively a better outcome for the club for the limited resources and salary that they had. So they had a salary cap from their owner about $37 million, which in Major League sports doesn't get you too much talent. And so as a result, he wanted to really change the way that they were approaching the recruitment for the game, how they approached the players that they're going to bring into their club, and what the role of each of those players was at an individual point in time within a game. And really what he did as a result of that, with the help of the statistical teams, was to really start defining more and many new measures that in baseball, recruitment was like ACFI. It was about the subjective knowledge of that one individual and what we could achieve to optimize their outcomes for the game. But then as a result, they paid for that, and that's what he didn't have the luxury to achieve. And this is Billy Beane. And so the famous quote, "We need to change the way we think about a game," is effectively the resistance he was having with how he was taking this 150-year-old sport, and in the early 2000s started to really change the approach in which now not only baseball, all sports utilize, and they utilize big data on all their players in different ways, which you now see on TV when they can show you new stats like hustle rates and how fast they can run within actually scrimmages across rugby, AFL, all codes, but are all originated back with Billy Beane, the general manager, and the basis of Moneyball. So what he was doing with Moneyball and how it's applicable to AN-ACC and where we're going through right now is that these new approaches come every once in a while, and it does require an unconventional approach, because a lot of the times we continue to focus on approaches that just present the same problems and addresses a solution for something that doesn't exist anymore. And that was really what he was facing with. So his team designed an analytical and evidence-based approach called sabermetrics, which was really to collect data on many more aspects than what was traditionally or conventionally measured. And I guess thinking about that in the concept of how we evaluate our revenue functions in our organizations, I still have a lot of clients asking me, what should their ADS be? What should their voluntary assessment rates be? And in AN-ACC, it really doesn't matter, because that's not the basis of the approach and the data points we need to really lead us to sustainable and compliant operations with our services with this new tool. And that's partly what we need to now start to think about. What are the new measures that doesn't set us up for financial success right off the bat, but they're the incremental changes or the probabilities that if we get that measure right, then the next outcome will be more probable for us as a business to achieve. And that was really the beauty of what Billy Beane did for the club, is that he didn't look at getting wins. He looked at achieving every incremental outcome that would set the club up for the highest probability to achieve a win. And that's really what we need to think about with AN-ACC, is what are we seeking to achieve at the end of the day for the residents and for the Australian taxpayers and for the families and our staff that are managing this. And all of them are tied into really the constructs of what the Brooks study was researching and designed around AN-ACC. So it's quite important that that is an understanding that has been put into this new mechanism. So as we talked about with maximization, there's constructs of AN-ACC that have been designed specifically to minimize maximization of the old ways of working. And so that really leads us to the question that we started to get. Well, I understand all that, Rob, but how do we change our game as a provider? As where we're at right now, and where we need to start thinking about where we can go. So really, we put that into 4 steps. The first step is with care minutes. And with the audits of those care minutes now have commenced by the department, we need to have a framework of how we are collecting and reporting on those roles, and specifically the hybrid roles across our organization. But more importantly, we need to ensure we're collecting all of the eligible time that is already on the books and on the cost base of our P&Ls for that wage component. And what we're finding with a lot of the work we're doing with designing and working with providers to help them through this care minute policy, documentation, defining the frameworks, reviewing a lot of position descriptions, is that 82% of the clients that we've all gone through this with are underreporting in some shape or form. And this was something I did raise with Mark Richardson, and was actually quite an interesting hypothesis to think in the context of how much of the industry is still not achieving the star rating outcome. Both RN and direct care time, which as the last report was about 81%, is not meeting both of those. But thinking about what providers had gone through this process and achieving more minutes, I was proposing a hypothesis that maybe it's a much lesser outcome. Maybe it's 60%, not 81, or maybe it's 75. But in any rate, the first step before we really focus on driving more income in, looking at the care minutes of the case mixes, is firstly understanding what is the available minutes within your services, and are you catching all of those minutes across the business? And then be in a position that you can report on those measures in a timely fashion. So if we're having to wait, a fortnight plus a week, or maybe even 2 fortnights in a 3-month regulatory reporting period, that's a long time to wait before you understand how fast you're traveling. And I guess there is a nice analogy with an average speed zone of 3 kilometers. And in this instance, it's 3 months for all of our QFR periods. If we have to wait a month before we know how fast that first month we traveled, it doesn't give much time for correction around that, or for our teams to either resource up or change classifications or count for these outcomes. So certainly data reporting measurements need to be really near term and available, so that business managers can really make those decisions looking forward with their eyes open. And that really leads to the second and third points, which is all about then not only just reporting on the data, but being in control of the data. So I'll go through an example of what we mean by being in control of the data, because with AN-ACC, there is a lot of off-claim Medicare insights. There's insights on consumers that, maybe now a class 7, but they're being funded as a class 6. There's residents that may be a class 7, but they're now a class 4, or maybe a class 13 that's now a 11. These are all permutations that exist out there, but providers need to be in control and understand what that looks like across their services, not just what's changing in relative to what Medicare knows, like with ACC, and then drive a quick process to reclassify so we get the increased funding in. We really need to have a more balanced approach to this, with an eye on our available direct care time that's being worked, and an eye on the actual case mixes and the associated care minutes that come from those forecasts, if you will. So we'll go through a little bit of that, but that really addresses the points that when a manager contacts a service and says, okay, we're at 182, but we need to be at 179, what can you do to impact that? That's really the next evolution of what providers are seeking to achieve. How do I control this data and now start to influence decisions that will impact either a period of overspend, where we may need to speed up and recover more of the direct costs in our rosters, or we may need to slow down because we effectively have a high run of acuity residents coming in from the local base hospital, but we haven't lost as many consumers as we thought. So we're benefiting from occupancy, but the roster hasn't really changed to account for it. These are the points of data that we need to be able to see and monitor and measure to be in control of AN-ACC. The third point is really then about understanding the base cases of those demand templates of your roster. So a lot of work I know has been undertaken by groups over the last 6 months and alignment of those rosters. But one of the things we've been finding is that because the first year with AN-ACC, it wasn't a mandated care minute. A lot of the activities in which ACFI managers then brought into the AN-ACC world continue to play out the behaviors of funding maximization, cherry picking clients or residents where they see deterioration and they quickly act on it, but never looking at re-abled consumers and maybe bringing them down to bring that alignment in. So through that transition year, it really enforced a lot of the initial ACFI practices, but in the AN-ACC world. And so we started to see case mix distributions of facilities that didn't reflect their actual model of care that the facility would typically be aligned with. And that's because of, again, over a year and plus the shadow assessment period, if you're using those 18 months to really just pick out those bits of deterioration and only act on those insights, you can start to skew the case mix distribution to more of a maximized view, such as ACFI did when it finished, with nearly 54% of the industry having a high claim in it. It was then became a very skewed distribution through that picture and time of its consumers. Now that still works for AN-ACC, but with the constructs of it and with care minutes now being mandated, it requires us to think differently about that approach, an approach to funding. But we need to make sure those rosters also align with a star rating outcome as well as some occupancy changes, because as you move up in occupancy, and we are seeing an increase across the sector in occupied bed days, we need to keep an eye on that demand template, because as more consumers come into our services, even respite entries, there's less minutes to then be shared amongst those residents that are now in situ with us. So again, we can get into an under-reporting period quickly and not even observe it if we have to wait a month before we can actually see that data. So there is more data sets that providers need to be aware of and be monitoring in the context of the forward-looking operations. And really that leads to the last and final step for really changing the approach to AN-ACC and revenue management and compliance management, is that unfortunately we can't roster behind us. We're signing off on rosters fortnights in advance, and we need to understand where each of the facilities' position would be in that forward-looking scenario. So we need to use those insights that are available to us on our AN-ACC consumers that aren't specifically in Medicare yet, because they may not have been acted on from a provider's standpoint. And we need to look at those scenarios and also rinse them and run them against maybe some new admission insights. We may know next week we have 4 new respites coming in, and then on Thursday we have 2 permanent care entries. These are all things that need to go into your what if scenario planning, so that then when you sign off on that expenditure and that roster for the forward-looking period, you know within a strong likelihood where the facility will land with regards to the care minute achievements, star ratings, and also the financial cost expenditure in that period. Because the last thing we want to do is have to rely on exorbitant amount of agency hourly rates to fill some of those voids, because with the capped mechanism now, margin is now capped on the government entitlements that the taxpayers are funding for the industry to look after these residents. So we have to be quite aware of that and really optimize that element to give the best outcome to our residents. Otherwise, if we erode that margin through penalty rates, through overusage on agency, then we effectively are in a financial situation that's going to be quite challenging. So the approach that we go through is firstly, not look at just the uplift residents. We need 100% of all consumers to be effectively mapped with a data point or a forecast. And what we find is that there's between 10 to about 17, 18% of the consumers that are coming back with changes within their regular mapping. And that gives a position off the Medicare books, but to a provider of how fast or how optimized or maximized could the case mixes be at this service, which is what you're seeing on the distribution to the right, which is the maximized claim view. Then we can also see the view of how slow the facility can be with the re-abled consumers that may no longer represent the class 11 or class 10 that they had previously been classified by the AMOs. And by having those 2 data sets and mapped within the service, we now have what we refer to as our band of influence. And that really is our ability as an organization or provider to achieve the most recoverable funding for the costs that we're putting in those rosters from that instrument of now AN-ACC, because it's hedged. And it's very hard to add, or impossible, I'd say, to add 2 hours or an hour and a half to a shift to roster. But by using the insights around your case mixes, you can add 20 minutes to track 20 minutes. And it's really about that refinement to getting the business in a way that it can really optimize its entitlements, but optimize
Did everybody lose Rob then?
Yeah, I think that's Rob that's gone out.
Rob's gone frozen. So I can keep going. I'll try to pick up where he is. So yeah, really to optimize that funding. And the other point that should definitely be made throughout this presentation is we're not talking about the quality of care here. Quality of care is assumed. And quality of care is being managed by a different mechanism, by quality standards. So all of the things that we're talking about now is how to achieve a good funding result for the care minutes that you're rostering, not about how to deliver quality care. And quality care is assumed, and quality care is an individual pursuit. So really understanding the individual requirements of a care plan and the individual requirements of a resident, and delivering quality clinical care. We get this question a lot, and delivering a quality care to that individual resident is one thing. The funding mechanism is designed to algorithmically apply the taxpayer funding to that facility as an average. And it's done on a resident by resident basis. There's 2 components. There's a fixed component, which is at the facility level, and there's a variable component, which is at the individual resident level, and it's correlated to their clinical needs in a very coarse way. But really, it's designed to deliver that funding to those residents on a needs basis and broadly, but then really to be pulled up at the facility level, and the funding per resident, and the fund and the care minutes demand per resident are not delivered individually, whereas the clinical outcomes and the care delivered obviously is. And so that these two things are working somewhat independently of each other, correlated but independent. But this is the band of influence that we can achieve if we have the data and the analytics to understand the difference between where our portfolio of residents are in terms of their funding and where they could be, and therefore that we can set a target, we can fix the rosters to a certain degree, and most people have that approach. There are some people out there that are talking to us about having more flexible rosters, and that's great. But by far the majority of the industry is looking to have those rosters somewhat stable for the staff, for their own ability to attract that staff. And so setting a fairly fixed supply of care minutes in terms of compliance is on the one side, and therefore the variable becomes how you can actually manage your case mix and the changes that are coming in with occupancy to actually deliver compliance and deliver a great funding outcome for the rosters that you are achieving. And for most of the industry, those rosters are set on the clinical requirements of that cohort of residents.
And so I like that analogy. It draws so many parallels to what we look at in our data. So the Moneyball approach, where that was a real world example of how an organization used data to achieve best practice outcomes with limited resources. And so again, that parallel to what we want to do with that data, and what I can take us through now is looking at some of those real world examples from our industry and clients that we've worked with, and how really managing revenue and rosters efficiently and effectively is how we balance compliance with finite resources. Andrew, if you want to jump to the next slide, please. Rob still had quite a few left to go. Here we go. So I'll just walk through a couple of use cases from real world examples where these legislated care minutes have added a layer of complexity. And when we assess the effectiveness of clinical rosters, we often encounter reporting periods where that performance is different due to resident movements and changing care needs. Resident admissions, departures, reclassifications, they're constantly reshaping the resident case mix. And so taking a really prescriptive approach to claiming can realign the case mix back to a base roster demand template. And understanding and managing resident case mix involves analyzing the impact of resident admissions and departures, but really looking at the impact of the hypothetical or what if of known reclassifications. So that's where Rob was really trying to describe that off-claim insight. So we know a resident could move, but we don't necessarily need them or want them to move unless it has a benefit to the claim profile. But we also want to align those resident claims with the actual care needs as closely as we can. But really the importance to the business is aligning that claim profile to the current roster. And to do that, we really have to use data effectively. Identifying those reclassifications and documenting them accurately is really vital. Tracking how well we forecast outcomes helps us fine-tune that process and really fine-tune the care roster and match changing requirements with known reclassifications. And so you're just sort of seeing a cause and effect. So you're just reacting to these changes to bring it back to a point of normalcy or compliance within your means. And this ongoing analysis of the claim profile ensures that we are getting that optimal care delivery while being compliant and sustainable. So the necessity to balance resident claims with rostering really becomes evident when we look at the subsidy entitlement compared to the care minute requirement. To sustainably meet quality standards, we need to operate within our means, meaning avoiding financial losses. But striking that right balance involves using resident movements and reclassifications to adjust that case mix and to control the margin. So beyond just the average daily subsidy, that the margin remaining after that subsidy entitlement offsets the care minute requirement, that's really the performance measure of effective AN-ACC management. And so modeling resident populations and using cost assumptions allows us to identify that ideal roster configuration and key demand template, and the thresholds, where do we have to tip into a new demand template. And when we forecast future needs, account for changes in demand and monitor performance against a care minute requirement, we get that financial sustainability measurement. And this data-driven approach really empowers us to make informed decisions in real time, optimizing the current roster period and plan for future scenarios. Apart from all of that, we can also leverage this data industry-wide, so we can compare services across different cohorts and make strategic decisions based on occupancy or case mix or even market dynamics. And what we see on the screen here is in the dark blue an initial claim profile that's not producing enough revenue to adequately offset the current roster cost. And so by identifying uplifts, we've increased the margin and we're maintaining compliance. And then on the next slide, we'll see a claim profile that's in excess of the roster's capacity to demonstrate compliance. So we're at a 2-star rating with the current roster configuration and the claim profile. And so what we did was identified ways to move residents lower. And in this case, specifically, there were 69 residents. 2 of the class 13s moved to an 11 and 2 of the 7s moved to a 5. But there's a number of ways that really seemingly minor improvements in acuity can result in a lower class. In this scenario, the margin reduces because we're increasing we're reducing the revenue and maintaining the same cost base, but the margin actually only reduced by about half a percent. But the effect that we were after was achieved, and that was that the roster is now meeting the requirements. And Mirus Metrics is purpose built for this precise and efficient management of care subsidy. We understand that care minute requirements can be a moving target, often challenging to predict and plan for on a day-to-day basis. But Metrics creates a structured approach to resident assessment and reclassification decision-making, managing daily fluctuations to meet care minute targets without overspending. And this means a more stable and predictable care planning process and cash flow. Managing care minute requirements doesn't require a hyper flexible rostering capacity or casual work pool. With data, your existing rostering processes can seamlessly adapt to the care minute model. While there may be an increase in demand, data can provide you with the tools and insights to meet these demands efficiently. So as care needs fluctuate, our organization is able to analyze those resident movements and reclassifications to show strategic reclassification options based on clinical evidence and care requirements to maintain compliance and sustainability. And so that word, sustainability is one that we reference quite regularly. And it is the most appropriate word when we're talking about the need to really achieve these best practice outcomes within a finite resource. So we don't have unlimited staff, and we don't have unlimited revenue. And so that sustainability measure is really critical. And on the next slide, I'm just gonna quickly walk through some of the key elements within a facility balance sheet, and group them by care and accommodation, because the way the game is changing now, the way Rob puts it is that that business model that we adapted to with ACFI is really broken. We can't adhere to that model anymore, and this, I think, hopefully really demonstrates why that is, because on the right, that care cost center, so our AN-ACC subsidy, that is our revenue for the provision of care, and this gets a lot of attention, and probably rightfully so that this is our largest income and our largest expense, but they are directly linked. Higher subsidy levels will lead to higher care minute requirements and therefore expenditure. The margin available is fixed, and it's relatively small when we compare it to the actual by many providers historically. So here we're using cost assumptions that some of you may think are too high, while others will argue that the cost assumptions are too low. And this really underpins the very real need to assess this data and set targets at a service level. Every service will have its own nuance and unique approach to how it balances how it finds this balance. But within this cost assumption, so I'm looking at particularly our largest expense, our AN, EN, and then RN resources. So I've put in for RNs an hourly cost of $135, and I think it is interesting. When we look at what it costs for an agency RN, and over the course of a financial year, what is the average expenditure for an hour of RN time, and $135 as a fully loaded FTE would be an annual salary of $200,000. So when we add super and leave and insurance, so a total cost to the business for a $200,000 salary would be around $280K a year, which comes out to $135 an hour for a full-time employee, 40 or 38 hours a week. And so the same with an AIN, EN, which be a blended rate in this example, at $55 an hour, and usually these aren't salaried employees, but it would be the equivalent of an $82,000 a year salary, or 114, call it 115K total expenditure for the business a year. And based on those cost points, then when we add in allied health, lifestyle management, all of the consumables that go into the provision of care, we also have sort of a tech debt or expenditure around care management systems, rostering systems, Mirrors metrics, all of those things can count into that. And what we're left with is a profit margin of 50 cents per resident per day. So that's an EBITDA of what would be $180. So the point here is that there isn't margin available anymore in subsidy. So care subsidy is meant to be spent on the provision of care, which then allows us to sort of pivot to the other side of this slide, and that's looking at the RADs and DAPs. And this must be seen as a key to a successful business and really managed accordingly. We also have to have financial goals for the accommodation cost center, and these can include, building a financial war chest or ensuring healthy cash flow while maintaining the cost of capital, managing the cost of capital. The first step is to prioritize these goals, and based on an organization's or facility's unique circumstances and strategies. But really, to achieve the importance is to determine that optimal price mix and price for room and mix between RAD and DAP, and what are the occupancy targets, and we need to have support around that decision making and transparency, and really regularly monitor the local and national price changes to remain competitive. But just breaking this down, obviously the basic daily fee is fixed, the hoteling supplement is fixed. The RAD return plus DAP, this is based on a industry average, which is a room price of $450K, and then a relatively equal split between a RAD and a DAP payment, going back to the early days of LLB, 2014, 2015. We did see a much higher propensity for RAD payments, and that industry split between lump sum accommodation payments, RADs, was around 70% of non-supported room prices. And that has steadily declined to where we are now. I think it's around 52%. So really almost equal split between a RAD and a DAP. And then that's reduced again by 60% to show that industry average of 60% of residents funding a RAD and a DAP as a non-supported resident. And then the other 40% supplying or attracting a supplement, and may or may not be also making a daily accommodation contribution. Another interesting trend there is from LLB, we had around a quarter of the industry qualify as significantly refurbished. That's over 80% of the industry now is in that significantly refurbished tier of accommodation supplement. And so again, that is around $21 a day per resident per day. So we get a total revenue stream from accommodation around $138 a day. And then on the cost side, by far and away, the largest expenditure is the asset itself. So when we look at depreciation and amortization of that, along with maintenance and upkeep, we're already close to $50 per resident per day for that cost. And so, I mean, that's almost the entire basic daily fee taken out with just that before we even get into the next biggest expenditure, catering, and then down the line where we look at all of the other associated hoteling costs. But what we end up with is a margin that is closer to $14 per resident per day. So an EBIT, because we are factoring in depreciation of I think that comes out to about $5K a year. So that's, I think the point here is just that for the business to be sustainable, that has to be seen as the path forward for the new business model. And another, I guess, useful way to look at room pricing is to see the equivalent or reverse calculate a price based on the accommodation supplement. And I've done that on the next slide, where all I've done is just taken the MPIR and assumed a rate of return on RAD holdings. So the current MPIR is 8.15%. Investments are even term deposits are benefiting from rate rises. And so what this allows us to do is then say, based on whether you're significantly refurbished or under your 40% supported residents, but again, over 80% are significantly refurbished. And if you do have over 40% supported residents, the equivalent room price is $580K. And really, it is those services that have extremely low numbers of supported residents who are commanding the highest prices. And all of this is really just speaking to managing and admissions and associating accommodation revenue, and the complexity and ongoing process that requires careful planning and financial modeling. And I think following these types of steps, providers can navigate this changing landscape and really pivoting towards a new business model that seeks that sustainability from all parts of the business, where historically we were used to making really big returns from subsidy and operating at a loss in accommodation. And I think what we've just demonstrated is that just simply won't work anymore. So that's what I had prepared. Andrew, I'll throw it back to you and look at some client stories. You're on mute.
Someone had to do it. Thanks for that. And just in the interest of time, I'll just touch on a few of these. Certainly these slides will be made available, but yeah, there definitely is quite a variety of things happening in provider land. There is a number of approaches, but what we collected was, I mean, clearly some of the issues that are becoming apparent is, whether you're over or under investing in your resourcing for AN-ACC. There's a lot of variation there. There's a lot of challenges occurring where people are developing overcomplicated BI platforms. So business intelligence and reporting and all the various reporting is very, very important. Business creates management oversight, but they can be developed too far, and certainly AN-ACC requires a certain level of transaction management and transaction visibility of the data and the analytics that we've shown. And while that can sort of happen at a sort of reporting and management reporting level through a BI platform, it's not going to give the transaction level detail. It's very difficult to develop that into BI platforms. So a lot of people are getting into some trouble trying to get their BI platforms to do things that they're not quite designed for. Also, some significant number of people coming back to us now concerned about data integrity and security, and obviously all of our systems are ISO accredited 27001, and all systems should be, but definitely cybersecurity and data security and audit trails and all of that sort of thing become really important. Using spreadsheets is not really a solution in the modern day, especially when you're dealing with $10 million in taxpayer funds sort of per facility. There's a lot of money to be managing and through a spreadsheet. Having internal resources too focused on lower level tasks. So another issue that we see emerging is there's quite a lot of work to be done to generate this level of data. This sort of level of data. It was being done under ACFI, and we're capturing it, so it's not like it's new. But with the independent assessment model, a lot of that data has been captured and taken away. And one of the things we're advocating here is you need to create that level of data for yourself, and not just the data that gets captured when the department and the external assessors assess, but also the off-claim data. So all the data you collect on those same residents before and after they get assessed. And that same data then creates a bigger data set for you, and that's your own data. That's a data set that only you have, and that can provide a lot of insight. But some of these models, and again, these slides will be available, but sort of providers are using a system and focusing on the right data, but not enough. It is possible to be doing the right things, but not have the capacity to do enough. And there is definitely upward pressure in a lot of providers on not having enough resource allocated to doing this data collection for yourself. And so centralizing and getting efficiencies and even outsourcing, and we do this for a number of clients, is a solution. There's a lot of tasks, low-level tasks that can be outsourced, provide that underlying data so that you can use that data for management decision-making. Providers have been building systems, but get to the point where the data is not reliable. It's a very expensive undertaking, and a lot of providers who have been spending a lot of time building BI systems and that sort of thing are starting to get to a point a year later where they realize what we know very, very well, that building systems is not easy, and it's a very expensive and very time-consuming task. But more importantly, we're building a system that's been shared across the industry. The insights of all of those providers all coming into building one system rather than just building your own. So not to mention the technology issues and the security issues. Provider is only one site and has a manual process. Manual processes work well for small scale. But once you start getting those problems being multiplied, that spreadsheets and manual processes really don't work. They're not sustainable. Provider transitioned all their ACFI staff. It's really, really interesting to see the various models of how they've transitioned, like I talked about earlier. But if you've, you can be carrying a significant cost that is not counted in care minutes to manage AN-ACC. And so trying to manage this level of data, more efficiency through more efficient resourcing models is what many people are starting to look at now. And again, technology helps and outsourcing can help. And provider as a team that's managing AN-ACC but find they spend most of their time on lower level tasks. A similar point about getting your staff to be focusing on higher level things. I think we've just been monitoring the questions, and at 3 o'clock, really understand that some people need to jump up 3 o'clock. Really understand it's 3 o'clock in the morning here. I'm in Europe at the moment, but at 1 o'clock, understand that people need to drop off. But if anybody can stay on for a few minutes, we've had a couple of questions that really focus on things like the various profitability of different classifications. We don't look at the profitability. There definitely is minor differences between the profitability of different classifications, but it opens up the door of targeting, and that's something that the department's spoken at length about being very sensitive to. We don't want to have an industry where we think that residents are being targeted as they come into a facility. We want to provide care to all those that need it. But even so, the model is really built to flatten that out and make really quite minor differences between different classifications. So our experience certainly in the industry is it's very, very difficult and very, very uncommon for people to be targeting residents at different profitability levels to any degree. So that's that point. Taryn, anything else that's popped up in the chat as being important?
Yeah, there's been a couple of questions. So you've addressed one already there that we had an anonymous person ask. The other one has been around when we were speaking about the lack of confidence in the survey that we did regarding allied health staffing minutes data. Is that the same lack of confidence that we see there? Chris has raised that question, saying that she knows the department says it's been underreported, but she also notes that the big drop in the latest allied health data that we probably, I think she's referring to the IQ reports, the MIA results, compared to the previous month. So I know Rob's sort of talked about it publicly before, but I wonder if there's any additional comments there.
Yeah, Taryn, I can speak to some of that as well. I mean, as you noted, the allied health minutes, are a requirement of our Schedule 1 of the quality care principles. So be that as it may, what we're discussing on the data side has no real impact, or is designed to really impact on how we service the consumers, the residents in each of our facilities. I mean, that at the end of the day is governed by the aged care quality principles. This is more looking specifically the lens of how we report on the data and how we stay in control of the data. But getting into the allied health side of it, and also at ACPA, I was having some even education organizations approach us, just asking more about what we're seeing with all non-direct care time. And there is a real focus on trying to reduce as much of that from my conversations at the ACPA National Conference. And I guess it was a bit alarming to even hear that they were looking at how they can reduce even staff training time, because again, these aren't direct care. So there needs to be a balance, and this is what we're feeding back to some of the contacts at the Department of Health and policy side, to just ensure that that the industry isn't overcorrecting on it. And I think at the moment, what we've seen with allied health is that it is a necessity within our services and for the residents that we have, and that's why it is part of the Schedule 1 of the principles. However, I know providers are mindful of balancing the budget at the end of the months and be mindful of that time. And I think where that will get addressed furthermore is a more fee-for-service type of models where even families decide to even take more of an investment in the valuable allied health time with their individual families. I mean, when my father-in-law was in care, we did this to support his Parkinson's journey and to ensure he was building the strength and managing his Parkinson's with more than what the 4B clinics could invest in him. But that's something that I feel the consumers and families will have to play an active role in that discussion and that narrative, as well as with the providers. But also providers will need to start thinking about how they suggest those activities, how they can even on-charge those activities as we start to move into what Tyler was presenting on, and there's more awareness of really picking up further revenue streams outside of what has been conventional to us in making all the subsidy we need from the government entitlements, which, as we can see, that's getting much tighter.
Yeah. The other thing is obviously the department's monitoring through the reporting allied health minutes and EN minutes now. So they're obviously keeping an eye on the reduction in some of those groups and categories. And while some sort of reductions probably expected, they certainly are watching that cautiously to make sure that it's not dropping off too far. And it's another great example of data and analytics overall, and the risk-based model that we talked about at the start, where all of these numbers and all of these factors and all of this information that's being reported, builds a picture of that provider. And certainly if you're not meeting those allied health minute averages and EN minutes and these sort of things start to become flags of areas of risk that I'm sure the commission and the department will be taking an interest in and using to prioritize the conversations that they are having with providers. I just wanted to try and wrap up here. I'm not sure, Taryn, if there was anything else, but did you?
Yeah, we've got one more comment from Vijay just earlier now, obviously talking about that balancing act that we've talked about before, but he's pointing out the fact that there's changing the classifications, uplifts or downgrades in this quarter affects the next quarter's targets with the industry turnover for the staff and the ever-changing occupancy levels. How are they expected to forecast anything? And the best way seems to be to have a fixed roster and manage changes in the quarterly target with casuals and agency in the worst case scenario, hoping that the occupancy does not drop by too much.
Yeah, there's so many variables there, and it does differ from provider to provider. But I guess what we're advocating is that the data and the system just provide the greatest transparency of that. So trying to manage that without the data and without the more real-time visibility of that just makes that exactly scenario that you've just talked about harder. And so the only way to manage it is to have that data accumulating, to have a visibility of what your target is going to be, what your care minutes are now, what your potential is to manipulate that, to have a very clear picture of that. Just gives you the best indications possible of how you are going to manage that. But yeah, there's certainly it's not to say it's easy. It's to say that having the data and the technology helps. It's definitely not impossible.
Yeah, and I think just to extend on that too, I mean, that's where some of those 4 points I was setting out at the beginning about, what do you need to have in place? Yes, the targets are set quarterly, but you have the target in which you're achieving right now today. And as long as you can see the direct care time that the organization is then expending in a timely way, then those insights can be accounted for. Because remember, with reclassification requests, as well as admissions, it goes back to the date in which you make that decision. And so if you forecast that the resident will be a class 7 and you account for that for the month it may take for that to come out, you're still accounting for that within your own planning in that scenario. And that's why one of the key measures that the industry is really now focused on for correct AN-ACC forecasting is that predicted versus achieved rates. So we've got organizations achieving in the high 90% of those predictions. So when you start looking at these scenarios around those likely fluctuations, whatever scenario you're planning has a 96% accuracy on what you will land on. And so that's where it all comes together, but it really requires timely reporting of data, but also to be in control of it, you need that transactional level and be very accurate about all those forecasts that are coming through, and make sure the role of the AN-ACC coordinator isn't about funding anymore. It's about giving the business accurate data points to act on. And that's really the mind shift and mindset change that we have to start thinking through, because this is a different instrument than ACFI or RCF, and this is a different post-reform world of operations. And that will take time as an industry to transform. But with that, those are the things that now need to be really taken into account in our planning for subsidy and compliance management at present.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. All right, so in the interest of time, I know everybody's got busy days. Let's wrap it up there. Just a couple of quick ads. If you wanted more information, Tyler was talking about that accommodation side. We have a special on accommodation pricing reports. Find out where your pricing sits relative to the facilities around you. It's very important maintenance activity. We also have a Black Friday sale still continuing because of popularity on all of our training. So go and book in that training now. Again, these slides will be coming out to all registered participants, so you can act on that later. We are going to have our next webinar is booked in for the 29th of February. So save that date, and we'll be sending out the topic of that. There's lots of interesting things going around care minutes. There's lots of interesting things going on around governance. So we're just trying to pick the most interesting topic. If you've got any thoughts on what you want to hear about, please just add that to the chat now before you go. And also, any opportunity, any further discussion that you want to have with us, please reach out and contact us. Obviously, available for a chats to get more insight into your specific needs or your specific organization. But otherwise, thanks very much for joining us today. It's great to be with you again. Hope you enjoyed the information, and look forward to presenting to you guys again in the new year. Thank you.